Hi, today is September 18th, 2023, and here are my poems for the day. The first one is poem number 1507 for the year, The Back of the Business Card. To me, actually, the back of the business card that I was looking at yesterday is more interesting than the front. Not only does it say $150 paid, it also has what looks like a sequel to, or maybe an earlier version of That Old Dog, which is the last song on the Fluting on the Hump record. You see, back in the 80s, you didn't have a phone with you all the time to write stuff down in. If you wanted to write something down, you had to have a pen or a pencil. And if you didn't have no blank sheet of paper, you just had to make do with whatever you could find, like, for example, the back of a business card. That's the way it was. Times was hard. Poem number 1508, The Writing on the Back. The writing on the back of the business card begins with, I was born in a gunny sack about a half a mile from Mars. This is a reference to a line from a Sheb Wooley song called Roughneck that I first heard on a Johnny Cash album when I was maybe 12 or something. The first two lines of Roughneck are, I was born in a boomer shack about a half a mile from town. Papa was a driller on a wildcat crew and my mama never was around. Sometime before or after the writing on the back of the card, I would sometimes sing to myself, I was born in a gunny sack about a half a mile from town. Papa was a topless go-go dancer and my mama was a rodeo clown. Because I liked singing the song Roughneck, but I had trouble remembering the words because I didn't understand some of them. And even though it's a bit embarrassing, I'm going to tell you what I wrote on the back of the card, because even if you can see the picture I took of it, you might have trouble with the handwriting. I was born, quote, I was born in a gunny sack about half a mile from Mars. Hell, I think it was Mars. I really just don't know. Anyway, I learned to fight from a diesel train, and I know that train was from Mars. But I was about 2.5 years old, but of course, Mars years are longer than Earth years, so I don't rightly know how old I really was. Not to mention that old dog of mine. How that dog would howl when that ornery train would pull into town to give me fighting lessons. Times sure have changed. If this is a first attempt at That Old Dog, that would mean that I met Kramer in his studio, gave him $150, and booked the studio time. And then he gave me a card as a receipt, and I wrote on the back of the card, and then rewrote That Old Dog before we went into the studio to record it. But I could have sworn we had that song long before, and not shortly before we went into the studio. Hell, we might have had that song before my daddy died. There's so much I don't remember. It's a good thing that nobody, including me, wants to write a book about me. Poem number 1509, Shoe Dog. Oh, it's a song. Was it a dog in the shape of a shoe? I never knew. Was it a shoe in the shape of a hound? That would astound. Was it a shoe-shaped house in which your dog might rest? That's a good guess. Was it a dog-shaped rack on which to place your shoes? I have no clues. Yeah, that's about all I have of that. Maybe I'd do it like 3 times live if I ever played it live ever again. Poem number 1510, Boring Pool. The water in the pool was as thick as tar, and it took forever to swim a lap, and it was so boring to swim a lap. And when you came out of the boring pool, you were even more boring than you were when you got in. Even your sex stories would be boring. Your sex stories would be like, we fucked and 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 fucked, and then we had to take a break, and then we fucked and 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 fucked. That's what the boring pool would do to you. And last poem of the day, poem number 1511, Opinion Pole. The telephone pole had stood there for years where Highway 51 runs right by my baby's door. It heard everything and consequently was full of opinions. But after all these years, the opinion of which the pole was most convinced was that opinions were like assholes. Everybody had one. And the opinion pole dreamed of being shoved up the asshole of almost every asshole with a stupid fucking opinion. One exception, surprisingly, was Jan Wenner. In the opinion poll's opinion, Wenner still hadn't been reamed enough, but that asshole's asshole is probably so loose that the opinion poll, even as large as it is, would probably get lost in there. That's it. Thank you. I appreciate you.